In addition, there must also be a complete commitment to dismantling the entire globalist neocon establishment that is perpetually dragging us into endless wars, pretending to fight for freedom and democracy abroad, while they turn us into a third world country and a third world dictatorship right here at home. The State Department, the defense bureaucracy, the intelligence services, and all of the rest need to be completely overhauled and reconstituted to fire the deep staters and put America first. We have to put America first.
想了解特朗普团队中的关键人物吗？你对他的政治策略感到好奇吗？请关注川普阁。对于华人观众来说，马可·卢比奥这个名字并不陌生。他一直是中国的批评者，积极推动解决中美贸易失衡、知识产权盗窃和人权问题，主张美国在全球舞台上保持强势。在特朗普第二任期的内阁成员中，他是第一个获得参议院批准的，担任新任国务卿。简要了解一下马可·卢比奥的背景。他于1971年出生在佛罗里达州的迈阿密，父母是古巴移民。他毕业于佛罗里达大学，获得了学士学位和法学博士学位。他的政治生涯始于2000年在佛罗里达州众议院任职，之后于2011年进入美国参议院。在参议院期间，他曾在参议院外交关系委员会和参议院情报特别委员会中担任重要角色。在特朗普的所有提名者中，马可·卢比奥的确认听证会是最迅速、最顺利且和谐的。2025年1月15日，他举行了确认听证会，然后在1月20日，特朗普宣誓就职的当天，参议院就以99-0的投票结果确认了卢比奥为国务卿。这在美国国务卿的任命历史上非常罕见。他赢得两党全力支持的原因之一，是他作为前参议员在外交事务和情报领域的丰富经验，拥有了处理复杂国际关系的扎实基础。另一个原因，他是特朗普这次部长提名中唯一在国会有过工作经验的政治人物。尽管卢比奥是一个保守派共和党人，但他多年来的工作交集也与民主党人建立了良好的合作关系，这也进一步为他赢得了两党的支持。但最重要的是，这表示了在外交政策上，民主党和共和党有着高度共识，特别是在对中国、俄罗斯以及中东事务的处理上。那两党在外交政策上的合作意愿，也会让卢比奥和特朗普进一步坚定他们的外交方针。卢比奥的确认听证会更像是一个展示特朗普这一任期内外交政策的平台。顺便说一下，我个人认为总统提名人的听证会是了解总统执政方针和理念的重要途径。与国内政治人物那些含糊不清的发言不同，美国这些提名者需要在长达4-5个小时的听证中说服委员会和公众，从而获得支持。这要求提名人针对委员会成员的多方面提问，给出尽可能具体的答案，尽管他们可能不会描述详细的执行步骤，但会提供大方向的指引。那对于我们这些旁观者来说，这些信息已经足够丰富。那我们看一下美国将在不同地区实施怎样的外交政策。首先，卢比奥指出了美国过去外交政策和理念上的失误。
Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals. An irrational zeal for maximum freedom of movement of people has resulted in a historic mass migration crisis here in America, but also around the world. It's one that threatens the stability of societies and of governments. Across the West, governments now censor and even prosecute domestic political opponents. Meanwhile, radical jihadists openly march in the streets and sadly drive vehicles into our people. While America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries always have. The post-war global order is not just obsolete, it is now a weapon being used against us. And all this has led to a moment in which we must now confront the single greatest risk of geopolitical instability and of generational global crisis in the lifetime of anyone alive and in this room today, to promote peace abroad and security and prosperity here at home. That is the promise that President Trump was elected to keep. And if I am confirmed, keeping that promise will be the core mission of the United States Department of State. Now, tragically, horrifying atrocities and unimaginable human suffering can be found on virtually every continent. And I am certain that today I will be asked about the array of programs and the activities the Department of State carries out to address them. We are a nation who was founded on the revolutionary truth that all men are created equal, and that our rights come not from man or from government, but from God. And so we will never be indifferent to the suffering of our fellow man. But ultimately, under President Trump, the top priority of the United States Department of State will be the United States. The direction he has given for the conduct of our foreign policy is clear. Every dollar we spend, every program we fund, every policy we pursue must be justified by the answer to one of three questions. Does it make America safer? Does it make America stronger? Or does it make America more prosperous? Under President Trump, the dollars of hardworking American taxpayers will always be spent wisely, and our power will always be yielded prudently and towards what is best for America and Americans before anything and everything else. Prudence in the conduct of foreign policy is not an abandonment of our values. It is the common sense understanding that while we remain the wealthiest and the most powerful nation on the earth, our wealth has never been unlimited, and our power has never been infinite. And placing our core national interest above all else is not isolationism. It is the common sense realization that a foreign policy centered in our national interest is not some outdated relic. Since the emergence of the modern nation state over 2 centuries ago, countries acting based on what they perceive to be their core national interest, that has been the norm, not the exception. And for our country, placing the interest of America and Americans above all else has never been more relevant or more necessary than it is right now. For in the end, how can America promote the cause of peace on earth if it is not first safe at home? What good is America to our allies if it is not strong? And how can America help end the suffering of God's children across the world if it is not first prosperous here at home? That much of what we need to do to confront China is here at home. It's not just abroad, it's also here at home. We have to rebuild our domestic industrial capacity, and we have to make sure that the United States is not reliant on any single other nation for any of our critical supply chains.
And with 4 seconds left, how are you going to explain that to your average American, that we need this all-size society approach, and your point exactly, that it needs to begin here at home, and so that people from my state, Nebraska, will understand and get on board?
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take, to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
China is not in any way a developing country. You just mentioned they're a rich and powerful country. That's not a developing country. It's the second largest economy in the world. Clearly has the financial resources and access to capital to meet its own needs. So I think we need to end China's preferential treatment and hold it accountable on the global stage. I mean, we see it in the World Bank. We see it in other locations. Are there things that we can do and you can do as Secretary of State to try to eliminate this unfair advantage that they have? It's an open unfair advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to, first of all, and I mentioned this in my opening statement, we have to acknowledge that many of the global institutions that were created not just in the post-war era, but the post-Cold War era have been weaponized against us. And I can use a number of examples. The first is, you think about the Security Council of the United Nations, which was created ostensibly for the purpose of preventing global conflict. Sadly, two of the greatest drivers of instability in the world today hold a veto vote at the Security Council. It's basically rendered the Security Council almost irrelevant. By the same token, I would say I am not against multilateral organizations so long as that or any foreign arrangement we have serves the national interest of the United States. I do not believe, and the President has made this abundantly clear, President Trump, that under no circumstances should any foreign entity or multilateral or international organization have veto power over the national security interests of the United States of America. The second point that I would point to is that the Chinese have very aggressively played this. They have figured out, and it isn't hard to figure out, that even the smallest nation state has a vote at the United Nations General Assembly. And they have worked hard to not just court, but entrap a handful of votes around the world, and including in our own hemisphere. If you look at the Caribbean basin, in Grenada and places like that, where they go into these countries, and they don't just provide $1 million or $1 billion to build the stadium, they also give you $5 or $6 million under the table for your family and friends. They do that in place after place. We've seen that practice as well in Africa. So we need to understand that there has to be, in many of these parts of the world, look, we're not bribing anybody. We're not going to do that, and it's certainly illegal for American companies to do it. But it's hard to engage these countries who in many cases have legitimate needs when they say, the Chinese, we prefer to have your stuff, we prefer to have American investment, but you're not offering any, and so we're left with the only alternative, and that is to take the Chinese investment, even though it comes with strong strings attached. That include things like debt diplomacy or debt traps and expectations of diplomatic cooperation at these international forums.
这个发言其实很好地打破了所谓美国要重回孤立主义的逻辑。就像卢比奥所说的，美国没有放弃成为世界霸主的野心，但美国过去的外交政策过于理想化，反而导致了一个内忧外患的结果，世界局势也没有达到美国曾经所期望的情况。那现在美国想要重回霸主地位，夺回话语权，并成功制约中国，所需要做的就是先把内忧解决了。因为说实话，现在放眼全球，所有的大国、西方的国家、欧洲那边的、中东、亚洲、中俄、澳大利亚、加拿大，其实没有哪个国家是不存在内忧的问题，这包括经济、民生、军事。而陈旧的外交共识和全球化导致所有大国也被直接或间接的牵制而无法脱身。那特朗普这届政府就敏锐地察觉到，先解决内忧的大国将会成为今后世界真正的霸主，而美国与其保持所谓的体面，然后被约束，不如直接快刀斩乱麻。因为只要执行正确的政策和方针，美国现在还有机会从内忧外患的局势里脱身。对外完全重新制定外交政策，因为现实情况就是，除了一些言语上的攻击，实际上还是没有任何国家可以对美国改变外交方针而做出真正的制裁。毕竟欧盟连俄罗斯都没办法实施真正的惩罚。对内， 美国就是要成为第一个解决内忧的国家，也就是真正的重振经济，而不是像现在这般吃老本。外交政策也将会是以帮助美国解决内忧为目的。国库充实了，军队升级了，内忧解决了，美国将会凭借实力和威慑力而重回世界霸主地位，而不再是靠虚名。更进一步，若美国真的在特朗普的模式下走出内忧外患，那这个在民主国家将会产生模仿效应，西方民众也将会推动政府改革来提升经济，进一步巩固西方主导地位和价值观。而这对于中国和社会主义国家，这样的改革方针是没有办法效仿的，因为这需要大幅度的削减政府体量和减少政府资金，以换取自由市场的最大活力。除非能有新的政策和方针，中国在现有体制和政策下将无法跟上美国和西方的经济增长，那只会导致话语权的丧失和国际地位的下降。接下来的这些片段很好地展示了目前美国对中美关系和中国政治生态是有很深入且清晰的了解，不再是以前那种理想主义般的爱与和平政策。从侧面也可以说是开始认真平等地看待中国，而不再是以前那般高高在上的拯救者姿态。
It's obvious that Xi Jinping is positioning his chess pieces in preparation for war. He's directed his military to be prepared to take Taiwan by 2027, and folks, that's only 2 years away. Now, it's true that does not mean that he will invade in 2027, and it's also true that it's not predetermined. But it should be very concerning to all of us that he's given his military that direction.
I would also point to the Western Hemisphere. I know that sounds like half a world away, but you understand this issue. The majority of nations on Earth that continue to recognize and have relations with Taiwan, the vast bulk of them, or the plurality, are within the Western Hemisphere. They've undertaken a very aggressive action in just the last 7-8 years to get these countries to flip. They got Panama to flip, and they got Panama to convince the Dominican Republic to flip. They've targeted multiple other nations, and Nicaragua most recently, to flip. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind and make a priority. And I also think it's important to recognize allies in the region like Paraguay that have not flipped, and others who have stayed strong in that regard. On the porcupine strategy, because I know it may sound weird to people, or if anyone's watching this, I know what the ratings are, but hopefully not high. But let me just say that when the porcupine strategy, what it really means is you want to make the cost of invading Taiwan higher than the benefit. We want to discourage that by the Chinese believing that, yes, could they ultimately win an invasion of Taiwan, but the price would be too high to pay. It's basically deterrence. And I think that's critical, not just to defending Taiwan, to preventing a cataclysmic military intervention in the Indo-Pacific. And that's what it would be. And I would make one more point, and again, I don't mean to want to be alarmist about it, but if you listen to Xi Jinping, and it's important when you listen to him, and I say listen, read, don't read the English translation that they put out, because the English translation is never right. You have to read the real translation on what they actually said in their native tongue. What they're basically saying is that this is a foundational and definitional issue for Xi Jinping personally. And as a result, I think we need to wrap our head around the fact that unless something dramatic changes, like an equilibrium where they conclude that the costs of intervening in Taiwan are too high, we're going to have to deal with this before the end of this decade. I think we once again as a nation, this is not a Department of State issue, but once again as a nation need to prioritize the importance of our industrial capacity and our access to supply chains domestically, especially in key and critical industries. Maybe not every industry, but some key industries. We should either have a domestic capacity or an allied capacity that's reliable and can't be used against us in a moment of conflict as leverage. The third point I would make is we need to be actively engaged in the world. As an example, the Chinese own significant mineral rights and mining rights in Argentina, in Chile, throughout Africa. It's one of the reasons why the polar region and the Arctic region has become so critical as well in that regard, is because they are scooping up all over the world these mineral rights, port rights, etc., that place us at an enormous disadvantage in the long term. And it's what I said in that short answer is if this trend continues, we are going to wind up living in a world where much of what we depend on for our security, our health, our safety, and our economic prosperity will largely depend on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. And that cannot be a world that we leave for our children. So throughout Africa, we are now seeing the deployment of these safe city programs by Huawei. Now, this isn't just a commercial deal for Huawei. This is the ability to ingrain itself in telecommunication of these countries and establish itself as the leader in 5G. And now all of the other technologies that depend on 5G, additive manufacturing, the 3D printing and so forth, autonomous vehicles, they will all have to be drawn to the standards set by Huawei. That's not because an international organization set it up. It's because they've established market dominance, and it's a concern we have in multiple parts of the global south and the developing world. We need to be engaged that way as well. And I think their preference is to not have any trade and or armed conflict in the interim, because I think they might interrupt what they believe is a natural progression. I don't share that view. I think they have some significant domestic challenges. Nonetheless, I do think what we can't ignore is that at the current road that we're on right now is an unbalanced relationship, and that much of their growth and their progress has come at our expense, not because they outcompeted us, but because they frankly have violated the rules that they've benefited from but have lived by none of its obligations. So I think the first begins with a recognition that China is and will continue to be a rich and powerful country, and we will have to deal with them. It's in the interest of global peace and stability that we have to deal with them. By the same token, we cannot find ourselves in a situation in which we allow them to continue to flaunt the rules in order to undermine us economically and or industrially, nor can we allow them to undermine our alliances and our presence in different parts of the world. For example, I think it is clear that on that path towards what they view as their rightful place as the world's preeminent power, they want to establish preeminence in the Indo-Pacific. And that has historical ramifications or historical underpinnings, because they view these smaller countries as tributary states, that basically all roads lead back to Beijing, and they view that. Unfortunately for them, their neighbors do not view themselves as tributary states. And this is particularly true in places like South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, but also Vietnam and others, some of whom have historical disagreements with China. So at the core of our strategy has to be twofold. Number one, ensuring that there is a proper geopolitical balance between the United States and China to avoid any sort of conflict that could be deeply destabilizing and worse for the world, but at the same time ensuring that it doesn't come at our expense, that we don't find ourselves in a world in which we are dependent on China, or any foreign power for that matter, for the raw materials that we need, for the ability to make medicine, for the ability to fuel our economy, the ability to feed ourselves or our people. We cannot be a country that becomes dependent on foreign powers, and so much of that involves not simply how we engage in the world, but also what we do here domestically. That is not the responsibility of the Department of State, but it is important for us to point to that much of what's happened with China and much of what's happening now is what we are not doing, whether it's through our own industry and the development of our own industries, or access to raw minerals and raw resources that are critical to fueling and or building a modern economy.
The private sector, so-called private sector, is required to share any and all information that might be of use to the People's Liberation Army or to the Chinese intelligence agencies. And it is not a stretch to say that due to the tactics of people like, or strategies really, of people like Deng Xiaoping, who said, hide your motives and bide your time, we've seen massive U.S. investment in China, which has not only helped them rebuild their economy, which is fine, but more ominously rearm their military, modernize their military so that they become a threat not only to their neighbors in the region, but to world peace. We can all imagine a nightmare in which China decides to take Taiwan, which President Xi said he's committed to do.
Well, I think in the case of NATO, I think I would expand it to really talk about the European Union and the EU, which I think is increasingly every single day coming to the realization of the threat that China's mercantilist policies and unfair trade policies are posing to them. They are flooding the European market with their cheaper electric cars, or attempting to do so. There's a dispute now about the importation of aluminum on sector after sector. You're seeing the EU confronting the reality. By the same token, they're like many countries around the world, including ours to some extent, there's a quandary involved. There is an intermeshing economic relations that you can't just walk away from, but you also recognize the long-term threat that Chinese practices are having on your economic lives. And so I think that's an area in which the Europeans are, some more than others, are increasingly aware and willing to be more forceful. Italy has been willing to lean into it more than perhaps some other countries in the region. Hopefully that will continue to change. On the security front, look, an event in the Indo-Pacific, say, let's leave Taiwan out of it for a moment and say it's the Philippines. Okay, in the last 48 hours, there's this massive, I don't even know how to describe it, but this massive ship that the Chinese have built that's like headed towards the Philippines, and the Philippines feels threatened by it, rightfully so. We've seen this on a daily basis with the harassment and so forth, but on a daily basis. If, God forbid, there is some miscommunication or some inadvertent conflict emerges there, and we have obligations to them, the impact that will have on the entire globe, the impact that it will have on the entire globe is enormous, and that includes Europe. So they have a selfish vested interest in seeking for the Chinese to curb their behaviors. I would also point to the Europeans that what the Russians have done with Ukraine would not have been possible without the assistance of China, whether it's the sharing of technology or aid in evading sanctions or selling their oil in secondary markets. The Chinese have been hidden, but clear to everyone watching, partners in the Russian endeavor.
Yeah.
And the Europeans know this, and they need to be continually reminded of it because it reveals the nature of who we're dealing with. Well, I think it's important to take 30 seconds down memory lane. Hong Kong was turned over by the UK with a strong set of assurances that it would remain autonomous and independent. It would be governed by the Chinese, but independent. They would have a democracy. They would be free enterprise. They would be left alone. In essence, they would, that's the promises they made. They have violated over time, they violated every promise. They basically broke the deal. Just like they lied about all the island chains that they said they weren't going to populate and militarize, and they have done so as well. And so today, we cannot consider Hong Kong to truly be autonomous anymore. It is not. It is now under the full control, especially on national security matters, of Chinese authorities. And it should not be surprising to us that these deeply rooted banking institutions that are in Hong Kong, who long had served as financial capital on the global scale, are now being used to the benefit of the Communist Party and to evade global sanctions. And I think there has to be a growing recognition of that. I also think it's important to remind those sectors in finance that are still involved there that the Chinese national security law that's now been implemented in Hong Kong allows them, if they don't like what you're doing, to basically trump up any charges they want, go into your offices, raid the boxes, see all of your files, threaten to jail you, and they've done so in some cases. So it's no longer a hospitable place for people to conduct financial activity. So I think we have to call it for what it is. The notion that Hong Kong is now some autonomous entity that operates within China's system but independent of it and the decisions they make is a complete work of fiction.
那对于台湾问题，卢比奥表示，在坚定立场的同时，也要增加台湾在国际上的曝光度和话语权。
The issue of Taiwan has been consistent and reaffirmed by every administration since 1979, and it is the combination of the Taiwan Relations Act with the 6 assurances that make clear that the United States, we're not going to pressure Taiwan into any arrangement. We're not going to tell you when we're going to stop, or if ever. We make no commitment to not helping them in their national defense. We're not going to force any outcomes. And frankly, we are going to do everything, and we reject any effort to coerce, intimidate, and or forcibly drive Taiwan to do whatever China wants them to do. And that's been our position, and that will continue. That was the position under President Trump's first administration. I anticipate it will continue to be in the second administration. I think within that context, it's important for us to find every opportunity possible to allow Taiwan to engage in international forums where important issues are discussed, and they're not represented. Irrespective of what China claims about one China principle, they're not represented. And so the views there need to be made. They need to have an opportunity in these forums to be made clear. But I think stability is critically important. Here's the one thing I would point to here with regards to stability. If the Chinese are in fact serious about stabilizing U.S.-China relations and finding avenues of which we can be cooperated and avoid conflict, then they will not do anything rash or irrational when it comes to Taiwan or the Philippines for that matter. The actions they are taking now are deeply destabilizing. They are forcing us to take counteractions because we have commitments to the Philippines and we have commitments to Taiwan that we intend to keep. And so if they want to destabilize the relationship, or they want to help at least create some pathway for stabilization of our relationship with them, even as we remain engaged in global competition, and in some cases more adversarial than others, they really need to stop messing around with Taiwan and with the Philippines, because it's forcing us to focus our attention in ways we prefer not to have to. I do think that whether it's the Millennium Challenge Grant, whether it's through the successor to OPIC, there are opportunities as well to leverage some private sector engagement from the American side and the U.S. side or the broader North American side on some of the, whether it's energy needs or resiliency needs or other development projects that they may have. So I think we have to explore that both bilaterally with individuals by ensuring that we have people there, but also explore whether we are fully utilizing the Pacific Island Forum as a dialogue partner to its full effect.
那接下来卢比奥说的是有意愿与澳大利亚和英国在军事、科技、稀有资源上进一步合作，使用联盟的优势稳定印太地区。他也描述了对亚太地区的策略。
Because it's one of I think it's almost a blueprint in many ways of how we can create consortium-like partnership with nation states that are allied to us to confront some of these global challenges, be it in the defense realm, in the technology realm, in the critical minerals realm, in the sensitive technologies and critical technologies on, for example, artificial intelligence and advances in even quantum computing. This obviously is more defense related, but it's one example of how we can leverage the power of these partnerships with allies, 2-3 countries in some cases, broader in others, to reach outcomes and objectives, such as creating a geopolitical and strategic balance in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. So we'll have to look at that and to see what components of whatever impediments exist can be removed by the action of the Department of State. But it also reminds us that in many of these, very few of these global issues are entirely reliant on the Department of State. The Department of Energy, the Department of Defense. We have a host of other government agencies, commerce in many cases, who also play a critical role in expediting and going through, for example, some of the lists of technologies that perhaps are not being transferred because they've been deemed as sensitive. But in the case of our strong and close allies, that's the point, right, is that you want to be able to find yourself in a situation where you can accelerate partnership by making available to key allies these sensitive technologies that we wouldn't want to see in the hands or developed by an adversary or unaligned country. Looking at the policy and seeing what can we now do that destabilizes that situation, that lowers the risk of an inadvertent war, be it between South Korea and North Korea, maybe including Japan at this point, and ultimately the United States. What can we do to prevent a crisis without encouraging other nation states to pursue their own nuclear weapons program? That's the solution we'd like to get to.
接下来是卢比奥说明 Greenland 的重要性。
Well, we're an Arctic power. The Russians are a legitimate Arctic power. The Chinese are not. Whether they're near Arctic power or I don't know what the term they came up with to give an excuse for them to be up there.
Quasi.
I think, frankly, I know you didn't ask me this question, but it's one I welcome the ability to talk about in some of this discussion with Greenland, putting aside all the things that are going on in the media. I think we need to understand that Greenland has been strategically important to the United States and to the West for a very long time. In fact, in 1941, at the outbreak of World War II, the United States was signed up as a protectorate, even though the Denmark had been occupied. You think back into I think Harry Truman tried to buy Denmark. Harry Truman had made an effort to try to buy it for like $100 million. He was rebuffed. And then the U.S. has maintained through a mutual defense agreement there the opportunity to to have military bases, and it had them for a while. Why? The reason why is because of where it's located geographically. Yes, the access to the minerals on Greenland are critically important. But as more navigable space is opening up in the Arctic, particularly this northern passage that goes from Russia to China, Russia to Asia, and could cut transit times by as much as 40%, the Arctic is going to become incredibly critical. And so we have to have a presence there. We have to have a presence there, not just saying, okay, we have a base, we have 200 people, or we have a flag flying. We have to have the ability, for example, to have the ships that can navigate on the naval level and keep those shipping lanes open if, in fact, they're being threatened. We have to have partners along the Arctic region that will join us in ensuring that the Arctic region is open for free and flow of navigation as these passages open up, because global trade is in many ways going to be infused by it. We have positions within the State Department that I think in the past have been diminished or people just haven't paid a lot of attention to. I just had this conversation the other day with Senator Murkowski that all of a sudden I think people are interested in serving in Arctic affairs and in Arctic posts, because this issue of Greenland has opened our eyes to the broader geographic importance of the Arctic region, which long has been a curiosity or something people have not talked about. But I think now we have the opportunity to see it for what it is, and that is one, if not the most important, one of the most critical parts of the world over the next 50 to 100 years will be whether there's going to be freedom of navigation in the Arctic, and what that will mean for global trade and commerce.
那最后这批片段是涉及其他地区的，包括巴拿马运河、中东和非洲，但高度概括就是美国将通过交易的形式来巩固周边地区的国防安全，也会通过美国政府影响力、军事威慑力和市场优势来实行私有层面上互惠互利的建交，从而以最少的美国军事人员派遣实现最大的经济效益和国防安全。这其中能源和稀有金属是关键的产业。这就是回归到符合常识的外交政策，而不再是自我感动的救赎外交。
Part of that deal, as I understand it, is it has this very tenuous but important 6-week transitional period where it's going to require international cooperation to bring some level of stability and administration. And that could serve as, assuming it works, that could serve as a foundation to build upon. I would also point to one more thing, and that is we don't know yet for sure, but there are opportunities available now in the Middle East that did not exist 90 days ago. Whether it's what's happened in Lebanon, whether it's what's happened in Syria, whether it's what hopefully will happen with this ceasefire and the release of hostages after horrifying detention and unjustifiable actions by Hamas. Whether it's any of these three things or all in combination, there are now factors at play in the Middle East that I think we can build upon and may open the door to extraordinary and historic opportunities, not just to provide for Israel's security, but ultimately begin to confront some of these other factors. What cannot be allowed under any circumstances is a nuclear-armed Iran. What could not be allowed under any circumstances is an Iran and an Iranian regime that has the resources and the capability to restart and continue their sponsorship of terrorism. And what cannot be allowed under any circumstances is an Iran with the military capability of threatening and destabilizing its neighbors and potentially reaching the homeland as well, both kinetically and directly, and also through their surrogate groups who have long planned contingencies for attacks. And let us not forget that this is a group, these are individuals that have spent the last 5 years actively and openly plotting the assassination of the president-elect and of multiple members of previous administrations. Steve Witkoff, who was charged with being an envoy towards reaching an accommodation between the Israelis and the Saudis, has been working cooperatively and together with the Biden administration. And in fact, I dare to say that all involved deserve credit for the ceasefire that the chairman's just announced. But Steve Witkoff's been a critical component of it, and he has been involved in it from day one. I think the broader consideration about whether we want to see a Saudi-Israeli mutual recognition and relationship would be one of the most historic developments in the history of the region for all the factors we've discussed here today. It would be, and one of the impediments to it has been this conflict and the ongoing conflict and the lack of a ceasefire. I also think it's going to be important for the Saudis and others to be participants in post-conflict stabilization efforts in Gaza and beyond. Yes, in fact, it should be a centerpiece. One of our centerpieces is our economic diplomacy. We talked earlier, I think it was Senator Coons had mentioned the work on fragile states and the hope of preventing fragility so that states don't collapse into some of the havens that you now see where terrorism takes a hold and so forth. And one of the things you can do to help a country become more stable and then more prosperous is access to reliable and affordable energy. And that's not simply for everyday life. That is critical if you want to build a manufacturing sector. It's going to be especially critical in a world in which all these new technologies like AI are going to require a tremendous amount of power generation that's going to draw upon global energy resources to begin with. So absolutely, it needs to be at the centerpiece, and we'll work very closely with the Energy Department in ensuring that it's a centerpiece of our foreign policy. I don't think anyone can tell you they have a master plan for how you fix that overnight. I do think it does begin with stability and security. You've got to establish some baseline security, and it's not going to come from a U.S. military intervention. So to the extent that we can encourage foreign partners, and I would include foreign partners in the Western Hemisphere, who should be contributing to this effort, to provide some level of stability and security in Haiti so that you can explore the opportunities to have a transitional government that has legitimacy, that can ultimately lead to the conduct of elections, and then have governing bodies in that country that can bring about a nation state that can begin to build some of the things you need in order for permanency. I think one of the things that could come about as a result of an agreement between the Saudis and the Israelis is that companies and institutions in both countries would now be open and able to invest in and or partner in the economies of each other. So the Israelis, as an example, have made extraordinary advances in agricultural production. Because of geographic constraints, they've had to be incredibly creative and nonetheless have been able to, and I think the Saudis would benefit from that greatly. Likewise, I think that we know, as a startup nation, that the technological capabilities and advances that the private sector has made in Israel, and that I think would be a great interest to the Saudis in partnership. In reverse is I think some of the energy resources that Saudi Arabia could provide, some of the financing for projects that they work together on. The linchpin of all of these is private sector engagement, but without the governmental imprimatur, or without the government creating the pathways for that to be possible, because of recognition, because of diplomatic relations, that's what opens, that because those don't exist, that hasn't been able to happen. This would open the door for that, and I think be transformative. So the first, and you've already highlighted all of the things about the growth that's going to happen. I think they'll double in population between now and 2020, 35, or what have you, so it's extraordinary. That isn't just an interesting number. That's also markets. Those are also consumers. Those are also places that I think provide an extraordinary opportunity, properly positioned, for America to become more prosperous. Literally, more people that can afford to buy the things Americans provide, both in services and goods, and vice versa. So I think there's an extraordinary opportunity. Where I think some of our situation in Africa has fallen off has been, it's been, and rightfully so, heavily focused on counterterrorism and solely on counterterrorism in some places. And that's valuable and important. It is very difficult for a country to progress or move forward if they are in fact a haven, for that's open. And so, the freaks come out at night and you've got terrorist groups that are operating and undermining that country. So it's not that it's unimportant. I think we're also learning from the Sahel how quickly the situation changes. Despite significant counterterrorism contributions, each of those countries have pivoted to their great mistake, grave error, towards the Africa Corps led by Russia. These people are not any good at fighting counterterrorism and unreliable, and I think the moment will come when they'll realize that, and maybe there will be a new opportunity to engage. On the flip side of it, if you look at littoral West Africa, there are real opportunities there for, and in fact, ongoing engagements, not just on counterterrorism, but on economic progress. I look in the north to Morocco, another place where we have already seen substantial improvements because of the accords, but also because phase 2 of that relationship that continues to build. You also talk about one thing that I don't think has been talked about enough, and I think we hear the term as a 19th century term. The impact that malaria has is not simply a health crisis or humanitarian crisis. It has deep economic crisis, deep economic implications. It pulls kids out of school for long periods of time and not end their lives. It literally sets people and communities back. Humans and people are the greatest resource of any country. And the cost benefit of an investment, leveraging private partnerships to deal with things like malaria, pays extraordinary dividends if appropriately done and channeled. And that is something that I think could, as part of an overall approach to Africa, be included in things that you could argue are improving our prosperity, our security. Ecuador faces a very significant challenge with illegal fishing off their coasts by Chinese fishing fleets who violate their territorial waters on an almost daily basis in massive quantities, and it's an ecological crisis as well on top of it. That's a country that can use our help tremendously. I think about the Dominican Republic. People don't talk about the Dominican Republic enough, and they face a real challenge because of Haiti and the instability next door. They were also one of the countries that emerged from COVID the fastest, and not just because of the tourism return quicker there, and they've really been able to do some positive things. I think Argentina I know people, some have not met the new president of Argentina. This is a serious, well-trained economist. I would not, if you sit down and talk to him for a few minutes, he has real clear ideas about economic development and is doing some really necessary things in terms of restructuring the direction of Argentine economics in a way that I think is very positive.
Can you talk about the Chinese influence in the Panama Canal,
Yeah,
what Americans should know?
Well, let me tell you, I actually didn't print a lot of, things to read like verbatim here, but there's one that I thought was interesting that I wanted to share, and I'm not going to put it out there for everybody, but the whole thing, but maybe I'll submit it for the record. But I just went through, this thing with Panama on the canal is not new. I visited there, I think it was 2016. I think I've consistently seen people express concern about it, and it's encapsulated here in quote after quote. Let me tell you, the former U.S. ambassador who served under President Obama said, the Chinese see in Panama what we saw in Panama throughout the 20th century, a maritime and aviation logistics hub. Just immediate past head of U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson, said, I was just in Panama about a month ago and flying along the Panama Canal and looking at the state-owned enterprises from the People's Republic of China on each side of the Panama Canal. They look like civilian companies or state-owned enterprises that could be used for dual use and could be quickly changed over to a military capability. We see questions that were asked by the ranking member in the House China Select Committee, where he asked a witness and they agreed that in a time of conflict, China could use its presence on both ends of the canal as a choke point against the United States in a conflict situation. So the concerns about Panama have been expressed by people on both sides of the aisle for at least the entire time that I've been in the United States Senate, and they've only accelerated further. And this is a very legitimate issue that we face there. And I think I'm not prepared to answer this question because I haven't looked at the legal research behind it yet, but I'm compelled to suspect that an argument could be made that the terms under which that canal were turned over have been violated because while technically sovereignty over the canal has not been turned over to a foreign power, in reality, a foreign power today possesses, through their companies, which we know are not independent, the ability to turn the canal into a choke point in a moment of conflict, and that is a direct threat to the national interest and security of the United States, and it's particularly galling given the fact that we paid for it and that 5,000 Americans died making it. That said, Panama is a great partner on a lot of other issues, and I hope we can resolve this issue of the canal and of its security and also continue to work with them cooperatively on a host of issues we share in common, including what to do with
Thank you.
migration.
Senator, I'm out of time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Senator Rubio, I think that you're right about doing an analysis of the turnover documents, but I think even before that, we ought to do an analysis of the original documents that went into place because they were very strong documents giving us control over a 5-mile wide on each side of the canal path and was very specific. So I think a legal analysis beginning to end is critical. Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member. Senator Rubio, nice to see you again. Thanks for taking the time with me, and thank you for being willing to serve. I want to start with the Pacific Islands. As you know, it's an area of focus of mine, and the Indo-Pacific is, look, we've been through several administrations, and they all say the same thing. They all talk about the future being in the Indo-Pacific and that it's the most important region in the world. That continues to be true. My concern is that specifically when people talk about the Indo-Pacific, they're mostly talking about China. They may be talking about other East Asian countries, but there's very little conversation about Pacific Island nations. And we've got some auspicious things happening, but we've also got some challenges in front of us. The embassy in Kiribati is stalled. The Solomon Islands, as you know, are sort of contemplating making themselves available for PRC military forces. So we passed the Compact of Free Association. It's a bit of a mixed bag. And I'd like to just hear your theory of the case here about how to have some continuity. Obviously, it's a new administration. It's going to be a new State Department. But I think some of the things that have happened over the last 4 and even 8 years in terms of Pacific Island relationships have been good for the United States of America. So give me your theory of the case, not generally Indo-Asia Pacific, but specifically these small island nations with whom we want stronger ties?
Sure. So I think the first, obviously, is the ability to engage bilaterally with each of these individual nation states, and that opportunity is already there. I think we should continue to build on it, and it's important and bears great fruit. I think the second, and it's an open question, which I certainly want the State Department to look at, and I think policymakers on the Hill need to consider as well, is, we are dialogue partners in the Pacific Island Forum. And the question is whether we are fully utilizing that ability to be at the table in that forum. Now, that forum includes Australia and New Zealand, which are bigger than some of these, but nonetheless important elements of it. And look, I think our expectations of the forum is, and they've had some internal friction with some of the member states, about who's going to lead it and how the succession. So we hope they can work that out. But it's an existing forum, which I think could potentially, as a dialogue partner, provide us the ability to not just engage bilaterally with the individual nation states, but also collectively. And we may not agree on 100 million things, but there might be some things we can do through that forum. At a minimum, have a presence at it at a high enough level that shows our level of commitment and interest has been elevated even further, and then ultimately some real deliverables. I do think that given, again, we keep saying they're small, but they're important both because of geographic location, their presence in international forums, and we have lost deterrence in multiple theaters around the world. So as an example, and I use this as a small-scale example, but it's really an important one. I think of the year was 2019, the Wagner Group tried to get cute and came after some of Americans operating in Syria. And fire from the sky rained down on them. And that group was pushed back pretty hard. That's deterrence. They threatened us, and they knew what the response would be. I recall the consternation here and in other places when Soleimani met his demise. But I can tell you it impacted Iranian behavior for a substantial period of time. No matter how tough they talked, it impacted their behavior. I think it's important to reestablish deterrence. And to the extent that that's been lost for a variety of reasons, the lack of deterrence is an invitation to war. The lack of deterrence is an invitation to hostility. It prevents the very thing that we hope to achieve, which is peace and stability in the world. And I do think we've lost deterrence. And I think in some ways it contributed to what happened in Ukraine. An item I know is very close to you and you've worked very on, and we talked earlier today about, is energy dependence. I recall President Trump at both a NATO summit and at the United Nations, and I recall the United Nations one in particular, President Trump said Germany is entirely going to be left dependent on China, on Russia for its energy. And they laughed at him. There were diplomats in the hall that were snickering. That's exactly what happened. It is one of the reasons why Putin believed he could invade Europe, is because Europe would not push back because they depended on him so much for energy. Now, Europe is to be congratulated. They have moved very swiftly, particularly the Germans, to diversify their energy resources. But one could argue that we may never have had that invasion had that dependence not existed, because maybe who would have thought the European response would have been more forceful than he anticipated. So I do think reestablishing deterrence and strength is important, because it prevents war and it gives us leverage in diplomacy, where we hope to solve 99.9% of the global disagreements we hope to solve through diplomacy, not through armed conflict. Well, there are a couple points. The first is the Chinese incursion in the hemisphere involves, number one, investment of dollars. Like, as an example, they go into some country, they say, here's $5 million or $10 million to build a stadium, but in exchange, you have to let us build out your 5G network using Huawei, safe cities, and the like. And by the way, here's a couple $1 million for you and your friends as a bribe. Okay, that's their first level of engagement. They go in and then in some ways they create deals that you can not possibly pay back. So now you've got a debt that you can't pay back, and they have you trapped. And now they've got your vote at the UN and your cooperation on X, Y, and Z. And that happened in Panama, by the way. In 2016, 2017, that was well understood that part of the investments they made in Panama were conditioned upon Panama's ability to convince the Dominican Republic and other countries to flip their recognition away from Taiwan. That happened. So that's number one. The second element of their involvement is they go into a country and a Chinese company will buy up the lithium mines or access to the rare earth minerals in these long-term contracts. And that exists in allied countries. The Argentines will tell you there are a number of business deals that the Chinese and Chinese companies have gotten a hold of in Argentina that even if they wanted to back away, they can't get out of the deals because of the way they were structured. So that's number two. And then number three is their presence. The Chinese are actively involved in a military installations in the Western Hemisphere on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from our shores. Only a few hundred miles from where Space Force operates and NASA and Cape Canaveral. Only a few miles from MacDill, where we have Central Command and Special Operations Command. Only a few miles from Southern Command. Only a few miles from Eglin Air Force Base and the test range we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these things, this is real, and it's operating right off the coast of the United States. They have a presence in our region. So we have to acknowledge that this is happening, and then we have to be present and have counters to each of these, and/or there has to be consequences for each of these. Fortunately, the United States has strong relationships in multiple key countries in the region, and I think we have the opportunity to build upon that and in ways that can attract the sort of investment that they would rather have than the Chinese investment. But right now it's not available. It's not happening. There is no American alternative to what the Chinese are offering. So hopefully we can provide the openings for that.
但能看出来，与拜登和奥巴马相比，特朗普对外交是更开放、更积极的，也是更平等的，为美国的国际贸易增加了很多可能性。但这个最大的弱点就是可持续性。以后的政府也要对这种经济外交提供足够的重视和支持，不然一旦美国政府的威慑力不在，那这些生意包括平民将会成为他国筹码。
What I would define as success for the State Department is not just that alignment, but making the State Department highly relevant again. Sadly, and I think I've shared this with you in some of our meetings with many of my colleagues, what has happened over the last 20 years under multiple administrations is the influence of the State Department has declined at the expense of other agencies and also at the expense of national security councils because it takes so long for the State Department to take action. And so increasingly you stop getting invited to the meetings and they stop putting you in charge of things because it takes too long to get a result. So we want the State Department to be relevant again, and it should be, because the State Department has a plethora of talented people who are subject matter experts and who have skills in diplomacy, and it's not being fully utilized because increasingly on issue after issue, we've seen the State Department marginalized because of internal inertia, because of the way the structure works. So we have to be at that table when decisions are being made, and the State Department has to be a source of creative ideas and effective implementation.